Okay, two announcements first. The demography department will be a shadow of its former self this coming week, so there will be no sections, right? And also, your TA, Alma Vega, passed her orals this morning, so I encourage you to show her even more respect than you already do. Okay, today we're going to finish up this lecture on the interwar years and perhaps start on World War II. Where we left off was we were talking about whiteness, the hardening of the color line, both the lines between white and black and between Asian and white. We're going to finish the whiteness discussion soon, and then we're going to turn to three different groups. Filipinos, who are an unusual group because they are U.S. nationals and yet ineligible for citizenship after the 1924 Act. And as we'll see, the 1924 Act contributed to, or perhaps outright caused, a movement for independence to finally be successful. So the Filipinos gain independence as a result of this. We'll also talk about Jewish refugees, who have a much less happy outcome as a result of the collision between the 1924 law and the coming of World War II and all sorts of other things in Europe. And then finally, we'll talk about Mexicans. Mexicans are yet a different group. They're treated in yet a different way by the 1924 law. They are Western Hemisphere immigrants, so they're not covered under quota. But as we'll see, their situation is also different and interestingly contrasted with that of the Jewish refugees in this period. Okay. So let's continue. Review briefly. We talked last time about the dissolution of the differences between the various white European groups. Recall that the term whiteness came to include, in an undifferentiated sort of way, all of the groups that used to be seen as very different. The Irish and the Italians, for example, are now after 1924 quickly become part of this less differentiated mass of white people. Similarly, we saw that the census treated blacks differently. In the 1890s, 1910s, 1920s, the census enumerators were instructed to distinguish between blacks, mulattoes, quadroons, octoroons, but by 1930, blacks are just black. Everybody, even the single drop rule is embedded in the census enumerators instructions, which reflects also most state laws, perhaps all state laws by that time. So there's two parallel processes, a decline in the differentiation within the category of white, and a similar undifferentiatedness in the category of black. And then we had interesting issues of whiteness with regard to Asian. The color line between white and Asian is in some ways more important than, well, I should not say more important, but it's important in a different way from the color line between white and black. The black and white color line was mainly important to Jim Crow laws in the South, but citizenship was not at stake. After 1870, citizenship is open to white people and people of African descent. The people who are still excluded by this time are Asians, and that is why in 1922 we had the Ozawa case and the Thin case. In the case of Ozawa, you'll recall, a Japanese man from Berkeley, California, sued to be declared basically a white person so that he could gain naturalization. He was unsuccessful, so he was appealing his case, and his case was basically that his skin was white. The court ruled, yeah, you may be white, but you're not Caucasian. That opened the door for Bhagat Thin, a Caucasian person, to sue on the basis that he was in fact Caucasian. And the court, just a few months later, it was November of 1922 versus I think February of 1923, the court responded, well, you may be Caucasian, but you are not white. So we have a certain kind of clarity that only the Supreme Court can bring to a difficult question like this. We then looked at the Kartosian case, which was a few years later, 1925, in which an Armenian man successfully gains citizenship, is declared a white, despite his being, in fact, technically speaking, Asian. Armenia is within the Asian barred zone of 1917 law. Now remember, the Asian barred zone was only about immigration, not about naturalization, but it is an issue that's brought up in the Thin case. I believe they mentioned whether that had anything to do with it. As we'll see later, that will be an issue in naturalization law later on. But the point for the Kartosian case was that it wasn't that there were reasons that the court was capable of finding people who were not clearly white could be white, and in this case it had a lot to do with religion, it appears. Okay, so to summarize this, what are we learning from this? What are the courts trying to tell us? And I think firstly, they are telling us loud and clear that they don't know what white means. And in some of these decisions, they say that pretty clearly. I don't think it comes out quite so clearly in these Supreme Court cases. But courts, since 1790, have written in their judgments that could Congress please define this a little bit better? It's not entirely clear what white means. Another way of looking at it is that throughout these cases, whiteness evolves. In the first case, in the Ozawa case, they kind of appeal to science, and they say, well, you may be white. We don't know what white means, but we know what Caucasian means. That's a scientific term. Scientists have told us that you're not Caucasian, so we can deny your motion. It is in a sense deferring to scientists. Anthropologists have figured it out. In the Thin case, they toss that out, and they say, well, clearly science is no good because science tells us that you're Caucasian. So we're going to go back, we're going to fall back 10 yards, as it were, and rely on common sense. And we're going to say whiteness is what we think it is. It's sort of reminiscent of the Supreme Court justice who said he couldn't define pornography, but he knew it when he saw it. It's that's sort of an idea. It's much more vague, but that appears to be what they're saying. And then finally, when they get to the Kartosian case, it's more of if society has accepted you as a white person, then we will agree that you are one. Religion matters, intermarriage mattered. So if all those things are observed, then you probably are white. But in the end, it comes down to that. Whiteness is what we collectively decide it is. And we have seen throughout the course of this class that it has changed. That its definition has changed. Not always in the legal sense of who can be naturalized, but it's certainly changed in a cultural sense. There were serious questions about which European groups were white at the beginning of the 19th century. But by the early 20th century, white certainly includes all Europeans, where Europe stretches at least as far as Armenia. It usually includes Syrians, but not always, and so on and so forth. To this we could add, in a moment we will see another case where whiteness is also defined by treaty obligation. So there are other things too. But still the point is that it's socially constructed, that there's not any kind of clear line, there's not any biology behind it. And we can see that while the courts are trying to decide what it is, in the sense that they're looking at individuals and trying to decide if they're white or not. What they really are doing is deciding the definition of white. And as time passes, I mean, the fact that they ruled that Ozawa was not white meant that Japanese people were not considered white. Right? If they had ruled otherwise, they would have been, just as they did in the case of Armenians. They were white. They're white because the Supreme Court ruled it. So it is an example of how we collectively decide and how those collective decisions affect the future. But there's one last way of looking at it that I think is interesting and not necessarily related to what we said so far, and that is the possibility that this thing called whiteness is really entirely independent of race. And I put both of them in quotations because I'm not prepared to really define what either one of them is. But this is a naturalization form from 1939, and here's a blown up part of it. And you can see that what's interesting about this is that we have a category for race, and it's Italian, South. We have a category for naturalization, which is for nationality, which is Italian. But we also have a category called color, which is white. So as late as 1939, the federal government is still printing forms that have this concept of white as something that is clearly independent of race, something that's not determined by race. Yes? I don't know. I mean, I don't believe that there were other colors that you could put except white and black here. Because remember, the color line has hardened here. There aren't. We're considering these Italians. This is a Southern Italian guy, and he's clearly white. He's somebody who would have been, maybe probationally white, who would have been white legally, but he's darker complexion-wise than Takeo Ozawa. I wish I could bring a little more clarity to this, but I think part of the point is that there isn't any clarity. The race is a very mushy topic. In the 1920s, it's very up in the air. It seems to be moving in the direction, I think it certainly has moved in the direction of one common category called white, but it is unclear whether that category of white really is entirely congruent with race. In some sense, this uncertainty still exists today in a different form. The Census Bureau has been very clear since 1970 that Hispanics are of any race, yet a large majority of Hispanics who fill out forms for places like the census tend to put Hispanic as a race. So here's a different kind of confusion about whether there is this other category called color that's independent of race. I shrug. But we better move on because we have other topics to cover. Does anyone want to make some observations about this or questions about the whiteness story from the 1920s? Okay. Then let's turn to the Filipino story. Filipinos are another group that are not encumbered from entering by the 1924 Act. And since several groups who provide labor are, it's not too surprising that their numbers come up a little bit after the 1924 Act. But again, we're looking at a Depression era, so they're not particularly large. And we are never talking about more than about 100,000. So this is a group that's smaller in the 20s and 30s and 40s than, say, the Chinese migration of the early 19th century. Right? The U.S. population is quite a bit larger. The Filipino population here is still smaller than that of Chinese. So this is not a tremendously visible population, but it was visible enough to anger some. I should say, it was visible enough to get the attention of immigration restrictionists. And after the 1924 Act was passed, there were attempts to limit Filipino immigration as well, but they did not pass. It's not clear that they could have succeeded. Not clear that they could have survived a Supreme Court challenge. Anyway, another reason that I should say, like the Chinese migration earlier, these are also overwhelmingly male. Something like 98. Was it 28,000 in California in 1930? There were 28,000 male Filipinos and only 2,000 females. So this is another group that is overwhelmingly male, and that also gets the attention of people who are a little on the xenophobic side. The discussion from 1898 brings us back a little bit, because I don't think I've mentioned how it is that the Philippines came to become a U.S. territory. The answer to that is the Spanish-American War, 1898, same time that the U.S. Acquired Guantanamo, which you may have heard of, the base in Cuba. This cartoon, which reads, "Troubles, right? Troubles which may follow an imperial policy," is about imperialism. The Spanish-American War was an imperialist war. It was essentially done for the purpose of, well, hard to say for the purpose exactly, but there were those who were pursuing the war who were certainly intent on the U.S. gaining territory. And the Philippines was the last, can be seen as kind of the end of manifest destiny. It's the last piece of territory that the U.S. fought for, where, or say the first, perhaps the only, that it fought for without the intention of making a state. And so manifest destiny, the idea was for those people who were manifestly incapable of self-government, such as this guy, they were supposed to simply fade away under the van of Anglo-Saxon superiority. But that really wasn't the plan in the Philippines. So the U.S. simply acquired it, and it wasn't entirely clear what should be done. This cartoon also makes the case that there were some interesting racial ideas about Filipinos. Racial ideas that were, in some sense, which I will get to in a little while, in some sense were supported by the federal government, that Filipinos were somehow hunter-gathering tribes at a very low level of economic development. And that's simply not true. The Philippines was an agricultural society just like the rest of Asia at this time. There were, however, some tribes which were of interest to anthropologists who were in the hunter-gatherer state on some of the various islands. And that, I think, did color some people's opinions, such as David Barrows, you may have heard of. The Filipino usually frequents the poorer quarters of our towns and spends the residues of his savings in brothels and dance halls, which in spite of our laws exist to minister to his lower nature. Everything in our rapid pleasure-seeking life, and the more or less shameless exhibitionism which accompanies it, contributes to overwhelm these young men who come, in most cases, only a few years removed from the even placid life of primitive native of a barrio. This is the David Barrows after whom the building you're sitting in is named. Isn't that interesting? And he had more than a passing acquaintance with the Philippines. He spent 5 years there running the education system. So it is a little surprising that he was a little so ill-informed. nonetheless, he's giving us a view that is quite rampant at the time. Recall that they're almost all young men who come to the U.S. They also speak English, and so they're seen as more of a sexual threat than most immigrant groups. Here's another guy. He's founder of CSU. He's another academic. The Filipino tends to interbreed with near moron white girls. The resulting hybrid is almost invariably undesirable. The ever-increasing blood brood of Filipino coolie fathers and low-grade white mothers may in time constitute a serious social burden. I can see that the eugenicists were not fond of this group either. It is, in some ways, they were supported. These views were supported by the federal government, as I mentioned earlier. In the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, featured a Filipino exhibit, which was supported by the federal government, and in it included something that can only be described as a human zoo, which featured members of various hunter-gatherer tribes which were indigenous to the Philippines, and purported to show this progression from the Negritos to a Christianized Visayan, with lots of groups in between, and including the one that got the most press, which would be Igorots from Luzon. The purpose of the fair was really, of this exhibit in the fair, was propaganda for the U.S. administration of the archipelago, but it's certainly, part of the argument was simply that these people were racially unfit for self-government. So naturally, those people who found the Filipinos to be least able to govern themselves proposed Filipino independence, and they did so, as I said, after the bill to grant, first after an attempt to ban Filipino migration outright failed in 1936. Again, this is right after the implementation of the 1924 Act, which happens in 1929. The first attempt to grant independence is vetoed by Herbert Hoover, overridden, but fails in the Philippines. And that is, briefly, comes later, the Tidings-McDuffie Act of 1934, which would grant independence 11 years hence in 1945. The point of this is that these are strange bedfellows. The people behind the Tidings-McDuffie Act, not necessarily Miller Tidings himself, but many of the people behind it, they are imperialists at heart. These are people who would not, if they could have cut off Filipino migration, they would have preferred to keep the Philippines as a colony. The fact they could not meant that they proposed this. And as a nice little insult, they offer a quota of 50 thereafter. A very, very, very small number, obviously. And, of course, they tacked on Hawaii, which was also a possession of the United States at this time, could still import Filipino laborers. All right. Okay, so then let's move on then to the issues surrounding Jewish refugees at this time. Remember, we're still talking about the period of the 30s and 40s, the interwar years. And the Jewish refugee story can be seen as the State Department, as an effort by the State Department to thwart any attempts at granting refuge to Jewish refugees. First, we need to note, though, that refugee, asylee, and refugee status does not exist here. There's no mention in any U.S. law of the concept of refugees until 1965. After the war, we'll have Displaced Persons Act, we'll have a few ad hoc legislative attempts to deal with refugees and asylees, but there really isn't a category at this time. So refugees need to come through the labyrinth constructed by the State Department. I want to contrast that. This is the second set of bullet points really refers to the Mexican story that we're going to get to later, which is that while the visa authority shifted to the State Department, and that was part of the very intentional part of the 1924 Act. This is something that the Immigration Restriction League and its colleagues wanted desperately to do. I remember mentioned this before. The reason was that if authority to admit immigrants was delegated to Ellis Island as it had been, then you would have ethnic groups or ethnic organizations in support of immigrants would be there watching along with the nativist groups. So Ellis Island would be, if Ellis Island was a battleground, there politics would come into play as different groups would try to get some people accepted and some rejected. So shifting to the State Department, which is something that was tried during World War I for other reasons and proved successful enough for the Immigration Restriction League, that seemed very appealing, and so that was done. But if we're talking about Western Hemisphere immigrants, they don't need a visa, right? They are coming without a quota. So they come across the border, and the border is still under control of the Labor Department. So there are different branches of government that are going to control the Mexican immigration and the Jewish immigration. And unfortunately for the Jews, the Department of State, as we know, is a bastion of anti-Semitism at this time. Also unfortunate for refugees and for everybody. This is 1930. The U.S. and the world is in the midst of a depression. And so Herbert Hoover issues an executive order that includes this phrase: under conditions of current employment, it is obvious that any person coming to the United States seeking work would likely become either direct or indirect public charges. As a temporary measure, the officers issuing visas to immigrants have been instructed to refuse visa applicants likely to fall into this class. So this is sort of catch-22. The contract labor is technically against the law, so you can't say that you have a job. But it's very hard in 1930 to prove that you are likely to get one. Unemployment by 1933 reaches 25%. So here we see an example of Hoover using not the 24 Act, the LPC clause.